Hey listeners, if you haven't already, join the family by subscribing so you never miss another one of these stories. Let's get to 1,000 subs together. Now relax and enjoy. Working as a chef out here in the middle of nowhere, Nevada, was not something I ever saw myself doing, but the pay was too good to pass up. And they made it clear that asking questions was not part of the job description. The recruitment process was unlike any other, a series of interviews in blank gray rooms with men who never smiled and spoke in soft, measured tones. They offered a salary that erased all my debt, and then some, and in return, I just had to cook. The application was less about my culinary skills and more about my psychological profile. They asked about my childhood, my dreams, my fears. It felt invasive. But I signed the stack of non-disclosure agreements, each one more threatening than the last, and then I was on a windowless plane, headed for the dust and the silence. The base itself is a sprawling monument to secrecy, buried in sand and surrounded by mountains that look like they've been sketched in charcoal against a pale sky. My kitchen is in a subterranean sector designated for support staff. It's all stainless steel and harsh fluorescent lighting that hums a constant flat note. The air is filtered and tastes like nothing at all, which is a small blessing, because the world outside smells of dust and things. I don't have a name for the rules. Started on day one. A man in a crisp uniform that had no name tag handed me a single sheet of paper. The text was small and dense. "These are not suggestions," he said, his eyes holding mine until I looked away. The rules were strange, specific, and utterly non-negotiable. Rule 1: never cook with garlic or onions. Any form allium is strictly prohibited. This was a professional nightmare. What kind of kitchen bans aromatics? Rule 2: all meat must be cooked to an internal temperature of exactly 171 degrees Fahrenheit. No more, no less. A digital thermometer was issued to me. It was heavy and glowed with a soft green light. Rule 3: if you hear a high-pitched ringing in your ears, stop what you are doing, stand perfectly still, and face the nearest wall until it stops. Do not cover your ears. Rule 4: the gray trays are for Sector 7. The green trays are for Sector 7B. The black trays are for the special projects wing. You are to plate the food for the black trays last, and you are never to look at what is on the plate after you have placed the cover on it. Rule 5: you will have a scheduled 15-minute break at exactly 3 p.m. You are to remain in the break room during this time. You are not to attempt to communicate with any personnel who enter the break room during this time. If they speak to you, you may respond only with yes or no. Rule 6: at the end of your shift, you will scrub down your station with the provided cleaning solution, which is a vibrant, almost unnatural orange and smells faintly of ozone and mint. You will then proceed to the decontamination shower before changing back into your civilian clothes. Rule 7: you are never to attempt to bring any food item raw or cooked out of the kitchen area. Rule 8: if you see a door that was not there before, do not open it. Do not acknowledge it. Wait, and it will be gone. The first few weeks were an exercise in robotic routine. I minced celery and fennel instead of onions. I used strange powdered substitutes. That the pantry was stocked with. I measured temperatures with a religious fervor. The other kitchen staff were a quiet bunch. We exchanged nods and necessary words about stock levels and cleaning rotas, but nothing more. We all had the same look in our eyes, a kind of hollow acceptance. The money was good enough to make the weirdness tolerable. At first, the ringing happened about a month in. It was a sound that felt like it was originating inside my skull, a frequency so high and sharp it felt like a needle being driven deep into my brain. I was in the middle of reducing a sauce, and I froze, remembering the rule. I turned and faced the stainless steel wall of the walk-in freezer. I stood there, my back to the kitchen. The sound was agony. It felt like it was vibrating the fillings in my teeth. I could hear the other kitchen staff also stopping, the clatter of a knife being set down, the squeak of a shoe on tile as someone else turned to face their own chosen wall. It lasted for maybe 2 minutes, though it felt like an hour. When it stopped, the silence that followed was profound and ringing in its own way. We all went back to work without a word. No one ever mentioned it. The thing with the trays was another layer of unease. The gray and green trays were normal enough, standard issue military food, well presented, but basic. The black trays were different. They were made of a material that felt oddly warm to the touch. and the dome covers that went over them were heavy and sealed with a faint hiss of air. The meals for those trays were pre-portioned in small containers. I was to arrange them on the plate. Without looking too closely, the food was strange cuts of meat that were either too pale or too dark-veined with colors that made my stomach turn, and vegetables that didn't look like any earth-grown produce I'd ever seen. Sometimes there would be a puree that shifted in viscosity as I spooned it onto the plate. As per the rules, I never lifted the cover once it was on, but sometimes from the corner of my eye, as I placed the cover, I thought I saw the food move a slight tremble, a subtle shift. I told myself it was the steam, the heat from the plate, my eyes playing tricks. The 3 p.m. break was its own special kind of torture. The break room was a small beige box with a table and a few chairs, a vending machine that sold only a generic cola and bags of plain chips. I would sit there and sip my coffee and watch the clock on the wall tick away. The minutes, sometimes the door would open and someone would walk in. They were never kitchen staff. They wore different jumpsuits, usually gray or white. Their eyes were always distant, unfocused. They would get a soda or just stand there for a moment and then leave. They never spoke. But one day a man with hair so white it looked bleached and skin that was nearly translucent came in. He didn't get a drink. He just stood in the middle of the room and turned his head slowly until he was looking directly at me. His eyes were a pale blue so light they were almost colorless. He opened his mouth and a sound came out, not a word, but a dry rasp like pages rubbing together. I gripped my coffee cup, remembering the rule yes or no. I said, my voice sounding too loud in the small room. He tilted his head. The rasp came again. It was a question, it had to be, but I couldn't understand it. No, I said firmly. He stared at me for a second longer, then turned and walked out the door. I let out a breath. I didn't realize I'd been holding. My hands were shaking. I skipped my coffee for the next few days. It was about 2 months, and when I saw the door, I was leaving the kitchen after a long shift, my hair still damp from the decontamination shower. The corridor that leads to the living quarters is long and lit by those same humming fluorescent lights. About halfway down there is a junction where another corridor branches off to the engineering sections. I must have walked past it 100 times. But that night, there was a new door. It was set right into the blank wall opposite the junction. It was old-looking, made of dark weathered wood, with a heavy iron ring for a handle. It was so utterly out of place in the sterile environment of the base that I stopped dead. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. Rule 8. Do not acknowledge it. I stood there frozen, not sure what to do. The door didn't look dangerous. It looked like something from a medieval castle. But its very presence was a violation of reality, a tear in the fabric of this place. I forced myself to start walking again, keeping my eyes locked straight ahead. I could feel it in my periphery, a dark squat shape that didn't belong. With every step, I expected to hear the creak of its hinges opening, but there was only the sound of my own footsteps on the linoleum. When I reached the end of the corridor, I dared a glance back. The wall was blank. The door was gone. The rest of the walk to my room was done at a near run. I locked the door behind me and sat on my bed, trying to calm my racing heart. I started paying more attention after that, noticing other small things, the way the shadows in the kitchen sometimes seemed to cling to the corners a little too long, the way the cleaning solution would sometimes foam a peculiar shade of blue before settling into its normal orange, the way the meat for the black trays sometimes had a texture that was wrong, too many pores, or a faint iridescent sheen under the lights. I began to have dreams, not nightmares exactly, but vivid, unsettling dreams of endless corridors and rooms that changed shape. And that sound, that high-pitched ringing, I woke up tired. Every morning, the money in my bank account was piling up, but it was starting to feel like blood money. I was just a cook, I told myself. Just follow the rules, do your job, go home rich. But the sense of isolation was becoming a physical weight. The silence of the other staff felt less like professionalism and more like shared fear. The incident that changed everything happened on a Tuesday. We were preparing a large order for the special projects wing, more black trays than usual. I was plating the main component, a pale cut of something that resembled veal, but was too soft. It left a faint oily residue on my fingers. The head chef, a grim man named Evans, who had been there for 15 years, was overseeing the plating. His face was a mask of concentration. As we all worked quickly and quietly, the high-pitched ringing started without warning. It was louder than ever before, a screech that felt like it was drilling directly into my brain. I immediately stopped, set down my tongs, and turned to face the wall. I heard the others do the same. But then there was another sound, a wet slapping sound, followed by a choked gurgle against every instinct screaming in my head. I turned around. Evans had not followed the rule. He had his hands clamped over his ears, his face contorted in pain. He was stumbling backward, and then he vomited violently. It was food. It was a thick black fluid that spattered against the stainless steel counter. And then he collapsed onto the floor. His body began to jerk and twitch. The black fluid was coming out of his nose, his eyes, his ears. It pooled around him. And then it began to move, coalescing, defying physics, and crawling up the leg of a prep table. The ringing stopped abruptly in the sudden silence. All you could hear was the wet sound of that black substance moving. Two men in hazmat suits. I hadn't even seen them enter, rushed in with a large container. They sealed the black substance inside it, and then attended to Evans. He wasn't moving. They loaded him onto a stretcher and wheeled him out. The rest of us were told to return to work. A new cleaner in a full protective suit came in and scrubbed the floor with a stronger version of our orange solution that smelled of burning hair. No one ever mentioned Evans again. His name was removed from the schedule the next day. A new head chef was in place by the afternoon. The routine continued, but something in me had broken it. Seen the consequence of breaking the rules. The reality of this place had finally shown its teeth. I couldn't unsee it. The black fluid moving with a purpose of its own. That night in my room, I decided I had to get out. My contract had 6 months left, but I didn't care. I would forfeit the bonus. I just needed to be gone. I started planning. I would wait for my next day off and then just not come back. But the base has a way of getting into your head. The next day during my break, the man with the white hair came in again. He walked straight to the vending machine, but instead of getting a drink, he placed his palm flat against the glass. He stood like that for a full minute. Then he turned to me. "You are leaving soon," he said, his voice clear and quiet, no longer harassed, but chillingly normal. I was so shocked I almost broke the rule and asked him how he knew. I simply said yes. He nodded, a slow, deliberate motion. "The doors you see, they are not for going out, they are for letting things," and he turned and left. I sat there, frozen, the cola in my hand, now warm. The following shift was the longest of my life. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow seemed to hold a deeper darkness. I was on autopilot, going through the motions of cooking and plating. My hands were steady, but my mind was screaming. I just had to make it to the end of the shift. I was plating the last of the black trays. It was a simple dish, just a piece of that strange meat and a smear of puree. As I went to place the heavy cover on the tray, my sleeve caught on the handle of a pot. I fumbled, and the cover slipped from my grasp. It hit the floor with a deafening clang. In that split second, before I could stop myself, I looked at the plate. The meat was not meat. It was a layer of skin, covered in a fine downy hair, and beneath it, I could see something pulsing rhythmically, a slow, lazy beat. And then the puree. It was to puree at all. It was a cluster of tiny glistening eggs or seeds. And as I watched one of them split open and a minute translucent tendril uncurled into the air, I stumbled back, gagging, bile rising in my throat. I righted myself, my heart hammering against my ribs. I grabbed another cover, sealed the tray, and sent it on its way, hoping desperately that no one had seen my mistake. No alarm was raised. No men in hazmat suits came for me. The rest of the shift passed in a blur of terror. I scrubbed my station until the orange solution had burned my skin raw. I stood under the decontamination shower until the water ran cold. I changed into my clothes, and I walked out of that kitchen for what I knew was the last time. I was not going to wait for my day off. I was leaving now. I marched down the familiar corridors toward the exit. My pass felt like a lead weight in my pocket. I expected to be stopped at every turn, but no one even looked at me. I reached the main exit, a massive reinforced airlock door. A guard sat behind a console. I handed him my pass. He scanned it. His screen flashed red, not green. He looked up at me, his expression unreadable. "Your final clearance is pending. You need to report to administration for out-processing," he said. Administration was in the opposite direction from freedom. My heart sank, but I nodded. I turned and walked away from the exit, pretending to head toward admin. As soon as I was around the corner, I broke into a run. I was not going back. I was not going to sit in another gray room. I remembered there was an old freight elevator that the maintenance guys used. It was supposed to be off limits, but it was my only shot. I ducked into a service corridor. The lighting was dimmer here. I could hear the hum of machinery all around me. I found the elevator. The call button was dusty. I pressed it, and to my amazement, the doors opened with a groan. I got in and saw the buttons for sublevels. I pressed the one for the surface. The doors closed, and the elevator began its slow ascent. It stopped with a jolt. The doors opened not onto the familiar main hangar, but onto a corridor I had never seen before. It was narrow and poorly lit. The walls were rough concrete, and the air was cold and damp with a metallic tang. I had taken a wrong turn, gotten off on the wrong level. I stepped out. The elevator doors shut behind me, and I heard it immediately begin to descend, leaving me there. I was trapped. I had to find another way. I started walking. The corridor seemed to go on forever. Doors lined the walls, but they were all sealed with heavy industrial locks, with no windows. I kept walking. The air grew colder, and I began to hear a sound, a faint rhythmic scraping up ahead. I slowed my steps. The corridor ended in a single door. This one was not locked. It was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness beckoning from within. Against every single instinct I had, I pushed the door open. The room was large and circular and dark. The only light came from a single source in the center of the room, a large glass tank filled with a glowing green liquid, and suspended in the liquid was a shape I couldn't immediately process. It was large and pale and vaguely humanoid, but its limbs were too long, its head too large and hairless. Its eyes were closed, and it was perfectly still. But as I watched, its long fingers, which ended in sharp points, twitched and began to scrape slowly against the inside of the glass. The sound I had heard, it was hooked up to tubes and wires that ran into the darkness above, and I realized with a dawning horror that the tubes were not providing sustenance to it. They were taking something away. A faint shimmering fluid was being pumped from its body into the network of pipes, and I knew with a sudden gut-wrenching certainty where the meat for the black trays came from. The thing in the tank opened its eyes. They were solid black, and they fixed directly on me. A pressure began to build in my head, the high-pitched ringing, not from a speaker or an alarm, but from inside my mind. I tried to turn to run, but my feet were glued to the floor. The ringing intensified until I thought my skull would split open. And then a voice that was not a voice spoke inside my head. It was a cold, ancient sound, full of a loneliness so profound it felt like a physical void. It showed me things not with images, but with sensations. The cold darkness of space, the crushing pressure of depth, the desperate need to connect, to communicate, to be understood. It had not come here to invade. It had crashed. It was a prisoner, and they were harvesting it, sustaining themselves on it. And it was so terribly alone. And then the connection broke. The ringing stopped. I was on my hands and knees on the cold floor, vomiting. I scrambled backward out of the room and ran blindly down the corridor. I don't know how I found my way back to the main levels. I must have looked like a madman, wild-eyed and pale. But no one stopped me. I finally burst out into the Nevada night. The dry desert air never felt so good. I didn't look back. I just ran across the sand until I reached the perimeter fence. I found a weak spot and crawled under, tearing my clothes on the barbed wire. I hitchhiked to the nearest town and caught a bus home. I never went back. I left all the money in the account. I changed my name. I moved to a different state. But I can't escape it. I see doors, sometimes in the corner of my vision, old wooden doors with iron rings, and I have to look away. I wake up in the middle of the night to a silence that is too deep, and I wait for the ringing to start. I know it saw me. I know it recognized something in me, a fellow prisoner in a different kind of cage. And sometimes, when the world is very quiet, I can feel a faint pressure in my mind, a distant echo of its loneliness. And I know the worst part of it all is that I still get hungry, and sometimes I crave a taste. I can't describe a flavor I never actually tasted, but somehow now remember.